All right, hey, this is Geoffrey Plummer, Outreach Director at Eastside Community Church, and I have with me Jay Mullally, a member of our community group at the church, and we're going to have a little outreach conversation here about a couple questions that Jay has, for me. One of the things that we're trying to do with these interviews is to have conversations that help explain what we really are trying to do as a church for outreach, and Jay's got a couple of great questions for us teed up right here today. So, Jay, what questions do you have for me to discuss today?
Well, Geoffrey, you're talking with some folks. I've had two questions that have been tossed my way. One is, well, it's not so much a question as a statement, and that is, well, I'm a good person, and because I am a good person, I'm going to go to heaven. Now, you and I both know that's not right. And the second one is, and I've had, by the way, several people who've asked me that or made that statement. The second one is somebody doesn't believe in hell, and the reason they don't believe that there's a hell is because we have a good God, and why would a good God send people to hell?
Yeah, those are common questions that we get.
Absolutely.
And I've gotten a lot of those over my career doing evangelism and stuff, so I'm not surprised to hear that. And I want to read kind of, I think, the main reason why some of these questions keep coming to this out of the book that came out of my doctoral dissertation, because the main issue why we get these is Satan is a deceiver. His whole game is to try to deceive the world, to keep us from getting to the truth. Now, you and I know the truth.
Right.
We've been enlightened to the truth, but a lot of other people have not been enlightened to the truth. So let me just read this for us here. It says, Satan is described in the Bible in a lot of different ways. He's called the serpent in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. He's called both the devil and Satan. The last name is especially important because he's called the deceiver of the entire world. Satan's perspective is to try to keep us from knowing and having a relationship with God. That's what he wants to do primarily. He wants to keep us from being able to get to God. He does it different ways. He deceives the word by telling the people that God doesn't exist and that he doesn't exist. And it's just a game, like this world is all that there is. He also deceives the world by teaching people that there are many ways to have a relationship to God. You can go this way, you can go that way, you can use Confucianism, Hinduism, Mormonism, Taoism, Buddhism, any ism that you want in order to get there. He deceives the world by saying that you don't have to believe in God to get to heaven. If you're simply a good person, you can get to God because you have a life of helping other people, and you will be in heaven. That if you do enough good, you will be in heaven. You can work your way there as a good person. And then worst of all, he deceives the world by saying that everybody goes to heaven. That it doesn't matter what you do here on the earth. Everybody will go to heaven at all, in which case there is no hell. And so he's trying to deceive the world in a lot of these different ways. So I wanted to hit both of the questions that you had, because I think it's all, they summarize with Satan's trying to deceive the people that we're trying to reach in different ways. And so the pattern kind of fits, and that's why the book was kind of important for me to segue into. So let's talk about the first one, which I think is, I'm a good person. Well, I can go to heaven because I'm good. There's something about me inherently good, and if I take care of people, then I get to heaven because I'm good. That I get a lot. I get a lot of questions about that. I mean, that seems like the number one go-to when you ask somebody about heaven or hell and how you're going to get there. I'm a pretty good person. I probably would have said that myself before I figured out the truth, and I'm sure I did to several people along the way. But the question that we have to ask is, by whose definition are we good? Is it the world's definition of good? The world now would say, you're good if you're inclusive. You're good if you embrace all different types of ethnicities, all different types of gender. Gender equality is a big thing. You're good because you're inclusive of everybody. That could be a definition of good. You're good if you do good works for people. You can be a horrible person, but you dedicate a couple of hours a day and you do good things, so therefore you're a good person. So there are a lot of different definitions of what good really is. So when somebody answers, I think I'm good enough, what their standard or their definition for good is going to be different than what what you and I
That's right.
would say is good. But realistically, it doesn't matter what your definition of good was. It doesn't matter what my definition of good is. It doesn't matter.
It matters what God said.
It's God's definition of good.
That's right.
That's the only thing that matters because he's the ruler of heaven, right? So his definition of good is the only thing that matters in this case. And we find a great example in the Bible about his definition of good. There's a guy named a rich young ruler, Luke 18. And in Luke 18, this guy comes to Jesus and he calls him good teacher. Jesus' reaction is like, why are you calling me good?
Mm-hmm.
There's only one good. The Father in heaven is the only one that's good. So immediately before this rich young ruler asks the question, Jesus knows what's coming. And he sets up the definition of good, not being his definition of good, but God the Father's definition of good. Not the rich young ruler's definition of good, but God the Father's definition of good. So he sets it up ahead of time. So the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and says, I have kept all these commandments my whole life. And he lists them all. Have you ever been with somebody who says, I'm good, and then they start listing all of the things they do in order to prove that they're good? That's what this guy was doing. If I'm witnessing to somebody, talking about Jesus to somebody today, that's what I get. You know what? I spend my time doing this for the poor. You know, I give money to support all these different causes. I'm inclusive to all these different ethnicities and people and gender differences and all that. I'm a really good person. They start listing things. Rich young ruler did that. But at the end of that interchange, Jesus says, it's great that you do all of those things. Great, you've done well. Rich young ruler is kind of a little puffed up, you know, tapping himself on the shoulder. Hey, he told me I did well. But then he said, sell all you have and give it to the poor. Not only your list, he said there's one thing you lack. Sell all you have and give it to the poor. And the rich young ruler goes, I don't know if I can do that. I need to think about this. I'm not sure I can do that. And he walks away.
Very sad.
Very sad because he couldn't do that. Well, what does that have to do with good and heaven? Because God's definition of good is to follow Jesus. That's the only definition of good, is to follow Jesus. And Jesus gave him a command and he didn't follow it. Therefore, he fell short of God's definition of good. You know, and that's a lot of the deception that happens in the world to people who think they're good. They use their own standard and not God's standards. So we really need to teach what God's standard is to people so that they can see they're falling very, very short of that, and then say the only way that you can get to heaven is to follow Jesus. And there's a lot of places in the Bible where we can point people to about doing that. But that's my first answer to anybody, you know, who says, I think I'm good enough to get there, is to figure out what standard they have for good and then speak into that. You know, so that's the step one for it. Now your next question was about hell, right?
Whether there's a hell.
Yeah, whether there's a hell. That's another great question. Whether there's a hell. So if you're a believer, you can also believe that there is no hell. That happens a lot too, because God's so good that he's definitely not going to send anybody to hell, right? So that's called universalism, where you believe once you're in, everybody goes to heaven. So that's interesting to be able to deal with. But for an unbeliever, you can't really point people to the Bible and say, well, the Bible talks about hell all over the place, because it does. You know, 2 Thessalonians 1 talks about that. You know, great interchange in Luke 16, where Lazarus is in heaven, in the bosom of the Lord, and then you got a guy who's looking over and says, just please send your servant Lazarus just to give me a little flick of water, because I'm in agony over in hell. And the scripture actually says there's a fixed distance and a fixed chasm that you cannot cross between heaven and hell. It wouldn't speak of that at that level if there was not a heaven and a hell.
Right.
You know, and then there are other places in the Bible where it talks about that, a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, where the worm never dies. Jesus called it Gehenna, or the eternal fire. I mean, and then Matthew 24 and 25, a whole lot of interaction between Jesus and the disciples about this eternal punishment and eternal life in contrast. Pretty clear the Bible teaches hell exists, and it's a physical place with distance between heaven and hell. One is a place the Lord is, one is a place the Lord is not. So it's with him or without him, right? And the him, of course, is Jesus, again at that point. But what happens, what do you do if somebody doesn't believe in the Bible and says there is no hell? How would you approach that? That's kind of the real question that you have. How do you deal with that? And so that's a fun conversation to have. And I usually will ask somebody something like this, you know, do you think that there's anybody in the history of the world that should be punished forever for the things that they
ask them about Hitler or somebody like that.
Yeah, so you got Hitler, Mussolini, you know, anybody associated with the Holocaust comes to mind. But take things in the U.S. recently, you know, Oklahoma City bomber, you know, mass shooters, anything like that. People who, you know, punishment on earth is not enough. And I'll ask somebody who says there's no hell, and I'll say, can you think of anybody that you believe should be punished not only for losing your life on the earth, not only being put in prison for a while, but really should get punished forever for the stuff they've done? Most people will say, yeah, and they'll have somebody in mind for that. And I said, if the consequences of what happens on the earth is all that there is, then that rage you're feeling when you pick this person you're talking about would be unquenched, right? Because, yeah, okay, they lost their life, but that's it. They need more punishment for that. And from a rationalistic perspective or a person, we want to see justice done. You know, you have a mass killer who kills 300 and some people in a building, turns the gun on himself, shoots himself, he's gone. What should happen to that person?
Well, he's escaped punishment, at least as we would define it.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah. And so we want to see justice or punishment. So it's comforting to those who believe in the Bible to say there's another level of punishment for somebody like that. And that punishment is not just temporary. Losing your life is a temporary punishment, right?
Absolutely.
You know, electric chair, gone. Execution, gone. I mean, we want to talk about real punishment on the way out. We could talk crucifixion. You know, a long process of death. But what the Bible talks about for punishment is eternal torment. Absolute eternal torment. Always going, always occurring, never quenched. And it's described as a fiery torment. So uncomfortability, overly hot, you know, pins and needles all the time, nerves always being stimulated. It's not annihilationism, because that'd be easy, right? If they get annihilated, that's easy. So even from a non-believer's perspective, somebody that doesn't use the Bible as a reference, you know, like that, we can make a rational argument that you, whoever is asking you that question, would want to see some punishment to somebody for things that are, you know, going on. And then I think there's also the living hell conversation.
That's right.
Which I think is interesting. And in that example, you know, people who have it tough here on earth, you could easily say it's a living hell, you know? I mean, that's realistic part of a conversation. Some people have a lot more difficult time here on earth than others. In that scene in heaven in Luke 16, where Lazarus is now in heaven in the bosom, he had a tough life. Because the scripture at that point says in there, he had it bad on earth, and now he's got it good in heaven. And the guy had it good on earth, who's now in eternal torment, and he's got it bad. So your circumstances on earth can change, right?
Mhm.
If you go to heaven. But the key of that is to make the right call and to go to heaven, you know. So the question is, how do you get there? You know, how are you sure that you can have a relationship with God in order to go to heaven, regardless of what your circumstances here on the earth are? How can you make sure you go to heaven? So any thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, that's always the key question. I know it's a stumbling block for a lot of folks. We'll get into that as to why it is a stumbling block. But as you and I know, it's a very simple thing. It's accepting the greatest gift that has ever been offered to man. And that is accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. So how do we convey that message? What's the best way to convey that message? And I guess maybe that's not the best way to phrase that, because for some people, the best way is, to give them that explanation and help them to see how they will
Yeah.
be assured of going to heaven is, there are different methodologies, I guess is the way I want to say it, or ways of explaining it that might work better for some than others.
Yeah. I mean, some people come to Christ because they're at the end of their rope.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they've tried it themselves, it's not working, they've fallen down, and now they need somebody else to help them and come back up. Some people have worked themselves to death trying to get there and need rest from that.
Mm-hmm.
Some people search their whole life. You see them moving from, activity to activity, relationship to relationship. They're always like searching for something, but never quite
Mm-hmm.
getting it, because there's an emptiness inside that they need filled,
And emptiness and a lack of peace too.
and a lack of peace. So when we talk about getting to heaven and having a relationship with Jesus, we want to make sure that we give them the truth and the facts. You don't have a relationship with Jesus, you're going to hell. That's what the Bible teaches.
Very clearly.
It's very clear at that. So we want you to have a relationship with Jesus to go to heaven. But people try to confuse the relationship with Jesus. It's really pretty easy. You said it yourself. Accept his grace, the gift of his death on the cross for us. Accept that, believe in him, and that's the pathway, to go. And you can know when you're really there, because things start showing up in your life if you really have a relationship with him, because things change. Take somebody who, has had a rough life here and a lot of bad things are happening to them. Before Christ in their life, they could be woe is me. They're always looking down. They feel like they're in a living hell. After they come to Christ, new perspective shows up. You know what? It's easier to deal with what's going on here on earth, because there's a future time when peace will come in, and it changes your attitude towards what you're living with in the circumstances here. So you can tell when somebody has given their life to Christ. It may not happen immediately, but you can see a change in their perspective. It really happens from that. And that's what we want our people we care about, we love, who are family and friends. We want them to have that peace in their life. We want them to be fulfilled with that. And you're right, it's very easy. It's very easy. In this book, page 27 and 28 of this book, there's a way to get there. And you can read that pretty quickly. It's admitting that you're a sinner, admitting that you made mistakes, admitting that your way has not got you to that relationship. You can't do it yourself. You can't get there on your own. You need his help in order to get there. That's admitting your condition of where you are, and then realizing what he's done for us, realizing that he paid the penalty for all of our mistakes on the cross, and believing in that. And when we do that, we admit where we are, we admit and agree and believe that he's made the way for us, and then just trust in that belief and give your life to the Lord. And you can do that pretty easily with a prayer and say, Lord, I'm a sinner. I thank you for dying on the cross for all of my mistakes. I really want to go to heaven with you. I really want to be with you in heaven. I don't want to go to hell. You know, please come into my life, take over my life, build in me the kind of person that you want me to be, so that I can be with you in heaven. It's really that simple with that.
And that's why it's so tough for people to understand, because our human condition says, well, we have to do something, we have to pay a price.
Right.
And that's just not the way it works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're built to work and we're built to achieve. And if we're not working for something, we think it doesn't have any value. You know, if we're not achieving it on our own, then we're not very good, right?
Right.
But when it comes to God, when it comes to Jesus, the guys who created heaven, they determine the rules on how we get there.
There you go.
We don't do that. So we've got to get our people to a position where they understand God controls the rules of the game, and here's how you get there.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, when you talk about the changes that you'll see in your life, reading the Bible is just so important. It is the truth. I mean, think about it. It's the oldest existing book around that has stood the test of time. Been found in many different pieces and parts, and it's always consistent. And everything that we've talked about here is contained in there. These are not our words; they're God's words. You know, for all have sinned and fall short of the grace of God. You ever have an evil thought? Ever done anything, any sin in your life? Doesn't matter. One sin, 1,000 sins.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. I had a guy that came to me last October, and you know, he told me he had kept all the commandments. You know, he kept them all. And I was like, you're a lot better than I am, because I think I've broken every one of them. But you know, good for you. And then I took him to that rich young ruler passage in the Bible, and I said, sounds like you? He quickly realized I'd broken them all, you know, at that point. So we all walk this path. I mean, nobody is superior over somebody else in this path. We all walk it the same way.
That's right.
And so we need to help others come to the way, and that's it. And so Jesus said that, you know, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father
except through the Son.
Except through me. So he's the only way to get into heaven. Right, Baxter? He's the only way to get to heaven. So I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Great questions. Baxter's ready to take Dad over there, so we're good.
All right.